Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar powered by hireEZ and the Recruiting Academy. I'm Dan Harten and I lead the customer marketing team here at hireEZ. A couple housekeeping tips. I strongly encourage you to throw your LinkedIn profile in the chat, start communicating and networking with everybody on this call. Use the Q&A feature and make sure you put reply all in the chat so everyone can see your comments and your questions. We will be monitoring the chat and we'll relay any questions that you guys might have throughout this webinar to Glenn. So don't hesitate to do that. I'm incredibly excited about this conversation because we're diving into one of the most transformative topics in recruiting, agentic AI. And who better to guide us through this than the famous Glen Cathey? But before we start, I want to ask a question to the audience. Have you ever hesitated to ask a question because you feared that others would think less of you or felt stupid? I'm always in this boat, especially around the topic of AI. And that's why I wanted to bring my friend Glen Cathey for the next 45 minutes to dive in deep. Any questions are related to agentic AI and AI in general and how it's transforming the recruiting industry. So I want to challenge you, take this 45 minutes and please ask questions to Glen to get your questions asked. There's no stupid question. For those who are not familiar with Glen, I don't know how you wouldn't be, but Glen is a true thought leader at the intersection of AI, automation, and talent acquisition. With decades of experience in sourcing, recruiting, technology, he has been at the forefront of innovation in our industry. And every time I want a question asked, I go to him. He is widely recognized for his deep insights in AI and the role hiring is going to be with AI. So I'm super excited to tap into his knowledge. So without further ado, Glen, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and privilege to be here.
Let's start with the basics. How do you define agentic AI and what is it? What differs agentic AI from like the traditional AI in recruiting, would you say?
Sure. Yeah, so this is, I guess this happens all the time when something is relatively new. And it's such an interesting phenomenon that, something comes out, there's a label applied to it, and then it becomes the buzzworthy term. And then there's some confusion around exactly what it is. I would hesitate to even say that I'm going to be giving the ultimate definitive definition, but having done some research and a lot of reading in this space and just thinking about it myself, the agentic, what it should be, right, and how it's different from traditional AI is the fact that it usually has access to systems. There's a degree of autonomy, and I apologize for using the term again, agency, but that ties into the autonomy, like it can do things on its own. Some people would also argue that if it's not agentic unless there's some degree of planning involved, where it actually can plan, adapt, and execute. So access to data and systems is important, but it's really the autonomous nature of it taking actions. And again, some people would argue that there's a planning component in there as well. So it's not just a fancier form of RPA.
You say buzzword a lot. People are throwing it left and right. Peel back that phrase of agentic AI and like from the average user, maybe I'm afraid to tap into this. And where do I go to learn more about maybe the definition or how people are utilizing it? A lot of the business leaders and the leaders within TA right now, I ask them like, what are you hearing? What are you seeing? And a lot of them are saying, hey, my people are saying, I want to use AI. I want to use AI. And I ask them, well, how are you going to use AI? And they can't really tell me. Like, how do you see the conversations going currently right now? And give me a very, very person, like, act like I'm five about agentic AI.
Okay. Um, well, it's hard to, well, maybe there are 5-year-olds that are using like ChatGPT or Gemini Gems, but I actually hear people refer to those things as agents, right? And I think that's part of the challenges is some people are saying, well, I've created an agent, right? An agent is something that I put in something and it executes, and it might execute on a number of steps and it might access a bunch of data. but I'd say that's like baby agentic AI. Maybe it doesn't even qualify. But I hear that a lot. People are talking about, I created an agent, and it's really, they just did a custom GPT. And that's not to belittle creating something like that, or Gemini Gem, because there's definite value in that. But you could argue that there's really not autonomy going on in that place. And it's like, what is it really executing? Like some people would even argue, and I guess you can, this is the problem with the spectrum, I guess, of agentic AI. You could argue that like OpenAI's deep research is an agent, right? So, or even Google's deep research, any of those, right? So you're providing some kind of input, and then on its own, it develops a plan and it decides to go out and it takes action. It visits a bunch of different places, finds information, and synthesizes it, produces it. So, I would say that's on the spectrum, right? But, that's like single, very specific use. Um, if you're talking about a wild imagination of the future where agentic AI could be at play, is that you could, now just because you can doesn't mean you should, but you could automate a large portion of the entire talent acquisition lifecycle, like literally from start to finish. And we can talk about some of the ethics and the responsible elements of like, well, there are some key considerations about doing things like that, especially around like regulations. But in theory, I'd argue that the technology already exists today to be able to do that. Things that people are doing today, where they're making decisions, taking action, learning from the output, adapting, again, taking additional actions. That's what people do. But now we have technology that's able to kind of replicate that human element of being adaptive and taking action and learning and planning. I'd say that's one really good way to look at it. But I do like to point out that there's a whole spectrum of agentic AI when it comes to like maybe something like a deep research where you have basics, and then you're just like, well, you can go as wild as you want in terms of imagining a workflow. And I'd say one other thing I have to point out, the reason why generative AI is usually a key component of agentic AI is the fact that it has the ability to understand and generate content at the human level. So, that's why there's already agents that exist now. They can have phone screening conversations with candidates, to the level where you could argue that it's close to human level. I mean, I've talked to people who have gone through the process and said, I've been forgetting that I've been talking to AI.
For sure, for sure. On the flip side, I read an article that you put out. You said that the true ROI of AI isn't just about automation, but about creating a collaborative partnership. What does that look like in recruiting, and how can AI enhance, not replace human decision making, would you
Wow.
say?
You were very timely on these topics. I appreciate that. Um, One of the things I like to point out around this space is that there's definitely going to be interest in companies saying, well, we can leverage AI and automation and agentic AI to reduce costs. But I don't think that you build a function or excellent experiences just looking at how do we reduce costs. Certainly, you don't build a fantastic business just by focusing on reducing costs. So I know that sometimes AI is looked at from well, how do we reduce costs? How do we look at ROI from that perspective? How do we drive productivity? How do we do more with less? Now, those are legitimate business interests, and I certainly won't deny them, and they are a part of the overall equation. But I'll be honest and tell you that what I get most excited about is that collaborative element. So you'll see a lot of people talking about and writing about and in articles around how you can use AI to automate the mundane, tedious elements of like sourcing, recruiting, talent acquisition, talent management, anything actually. And I think that that's not the highest best use. You can do it for sure. I'd say that's probably low hanging fruit. But I feel what some people are missing is the highest best use of generative AI, the fact that it has the ability to understand human level inputs. I was literally just before this reading an article that somebody wrote in the end of February talking about how we need to be aware of the fact that generative AI powered sales is going to be incredibly effective. They will be able to be more persuasive than humans, like even the best salespeople. And you're like, well, why couldn't we apply that to recruiting? Like the reality is there's already some studies that have shown that even like ChatGPT 4, like so not even the most advanced models available today have already proven that they can be more persuasive than people. So it's something to think about. Well, it's like, well, how do we bring it back to your question around collaboration? Well, why wouldn't I be excited about working with a resource that knows more than me, and that can mimic some of the most important elements of human nature? Like it can mimic empathy very well. Studies have shown that it can actually demonstrate empathy and emotional intelligence better than people, which on one hand sounds kind of creepy and disturbing. On the other hand, if you're looking at it as a collaborative partner, why wouldn't you want someone to have those skills to augment your own ability to, say, come up with more effective strategies for recruitment or more effective messaging or better onboarding programs, those types of things. So I think the highest, best use when it comes to generative AI is certainly going to be, how do we take our people that are already good at what they do and make them even better, because they're augmented with these fantastic resources that I wish I had 10, 20 years ago when I got into the
I
industry.
read the SAP survey. I think you read it and you wrote about it too. And it states that they found that nearly half of executives trust AI over themselves for decision making. What do
Yeah.
you think is the driving this shift, and how should recruiting leaders approach AI as a part of their decision making process? It's kind of shocked me that we think, okay, the average person is utilizing AI to get smarter and get better at what they're doing, but executives that are leading huge organizations, teams, even they're utilizing it. And the big word in all this is trusting it over their human, decision making. Walk me through your take on that.
Yeah, that really was fascinating. And what I wrote about that was the fact that on one hand, it might seem silly, like why would a seasoned executive or anybody actually say, "Hey, I'm going to trust this" when it comes to kind of advising me on what I should be doing, whatever the role is. In this case, it's C-level executives. And if this goes back to my earlier point, it depends on the types of questions and the ways that you're trying to use generative AI. And when you start to ask more higher order strategic questions, as if you kind of cloned yourself and say, "Hey, I want a second opinion," that's honestly one of the most overlooked, slept on uses of generative AI, in my opinion, is asking it for second opinions, or actually working with multiple different models and asking for a second, third, fourth opinion. It's really no different than asking for other experts. But in this case, and again, I'm not trying to overstate the capabilities of these systems, but I think some people are underestimating what they really are, right? So if you had a person on this call, right, that says, "I have the collective knowledge of the internet," right, with all of the good things, and some people would say some of the bad, but like, let's say I've read every single study on a particular thing when it comes to sourcing or recruiting, and I'm aware of it all, and I can actually synthesize the best research in that space and provide. As an executive, why wouldn't I use that as a sounding board, as a thought partner? Um, and you could argue that because it's not a person, although of course there's bias with regard to AI, and we can talk about that in a little bit. But if you've asked these types of questions, you realize that the output is very reasonable. Sometimes it overlaps things you're familiar with. And I just did a workshop with my team earlier today, and we have experts in certain domains. Each one of them was like, it came up some things I was familiar with, but there were one or two things that I hadn't considered. That's why an executive or anyone would use these tools, as long as you're using them in the proper way, to kind of even challenge your own thinking, or here's what I've come up with so far. What am I missing? It's a fantastic use case. And I don't know why someone wouldn't say, well, if I'm considering lots of different factors or large amounts of data, why would I not use this type of resource, which, again, depending on measurements, you could argue is definitely smarter than the average person, and certainly has a larger, it's not really knowledge base because it's not a database, but it's conventional collective wisdom and understanding of any topic that you can think of in our domain is deeper than any person that we have on this call. So it's not a replacement for people, but it's certainly a powerful augmentative tool that people should be leaning on. It was like, imagine if we could, at any time of the day when we're doing our jobs, have a question like, I think I've got my thoughts around this properly, but I can connect into every person on this Zoom. Why wouldn't I take their collective wisdom? I would. And you're doing that with AI. So on one hand, I'm definitely not surprised that and actually, I'm encouraged that executives means you're open-minded enough to say, I don't have all the answers, and I'm open to other opinions. And AI, at least as far as we know, doesn't have an agenda. So, if I'm maybe working with people on my team, who knows what their motivations are, right? But at least at this point, I would like to assume that AI doesn't have any motivations, to try to curry favor with me or something like that. It's not like I'm going to promote them, my team, right? Show them favoritism that you could when it comes to people, or people that are afraid to tell you the truth, which is another interesting element I hadn't thought of around executive use. Is AI is going to tell you what it thinks you're missing, what you could be doing better, and I think that sometimes people they're not necessarily 100% forthcoming sometimes when you're dealing with very important people, especially when they're coming up with suggestions that might counter what the executive has been saying.
Because everybody has a bias, right? And that leads me to my next question. Like, people tend to focus more on bias in AI than human biases in recruiting. How should companies think about biases in AI, and what's realistic approach mitigating it in the hiring process or just those conversations?
Wow, that's
I'll throw you a curveball, Glenn.
no, that's a great
No more
one.
softballs.
Yeah, no, I have a decent amount of experience working with assessing like what is fairness anyway in a system. And I think you have to begin with that before you can say, well, what is bias? So, many people will settle on like equality of opportunity. Um, what's also interesting about, I think, the dichotomy when it comes to bias is that I feel like the standards for AI bias are actually above what we hold people to, which I find ironic. It's understandable on one hand because there's obviously the risk of like systemic bias more at scale. And if you're dealing with, let's say, 100 recruiters and different hiring managers, everyone has bias. Doesn't matter how much training you have, it's unconscious bias. No matter how conscious you try to make it, it's still unconscious. It's still there. It's the one thing that AI doesn't have. But I believe that it's almost a marriage made in heaven, so to speak, to use that phrase to say, well, humans are prey to unconscious bias, right? And AI is subject to several different biases, like algorithmic bias and bias that can be embedded in the training data. It's almost kind of like the bias embedded in people. But I feel like together, you would probably come out with more fair outcomes. There's been some interesting studies that show that when you get out of our industry and you start looking at it from a job seeker perspective, that interestingly enough, a lot of people are actually saying I would trust AI over person because they're worried about bias. And there's a whole bunch to unpack here, and people can probably talk about it literally for a week straight in a workshop. But there are systems that are incredibly fair and can be made like completely blind to certain things like demographics. And that's something that people, you can argue, you simply can't do that to. And what's also interesting, and I keep citing the study because I think it's still one of the coolest things I've ever seen, is that over a year ago, Anthropic, that makes Claude, did a really interesting study about matching people with jobs. And they tested several prompts to try to remove bias. And one of the prompts was you need to ignore demographic information, and it's illegal to discriminate. And if you go look up that study, you'll see a nice graph that shows that with that prompt, the bias was almost zero across like 7 dimensions of diversity. And the reason why that's such a big deal is just take a moment to appreciate the fact that we are now in a situation where you can tell a system, hey, you need to ignore this stuff and it's illegal to discriminate. And it's like, okay, I'll do that. And it does it. And I know a lot of people are like, wait, can we really trust it? The data is showing that you can. Obviously, you should just keep retesting, right, and measuring and making sure that it doesn't creep. But you can't do that with people. So in that regard, it should be a strategic element of your approach to saying, how can we be more fair and unbiased? It has to involve AI. And one more study I have to share. I don't have all the details. I remember my main takeaway working with this vendor is they did a nice POC with a company, and they found that they could come up with a very nice, always like a diverse slate of candidates. And the only time that things got messed up is as soon as you put a person in the process, whether that was a recruiter or a hiring manager, and it started to skew things. And it's a sad commentary, but it's something we have to be aware of. So I'm not trying to say that AI is something that's 100% safe when it comes to bias. That's not true. You should be regularly monitoring these systems for bias and certainly mitigating them. But I think it should not be a fear-based approach to, well, we're afraid of bias. It should be, how do we leverage the strengths of AI and the strengths of people, and I'd say even kind of counteract the complementary weaknesses each have, so that we have a better outcome in the end.
Love it. Before we dive any further, there's a couple questions in the chat. Lisa said, can we name some examples of agentic AI versus non-agentic, just so I can get it
Sure.
straight in my head?
Yeah. And there's actually one like right before this. I was curious, right? So I'll tell you, I had some fun with AI, right? So I'm always checking with my AI partners. So I was like, if I wanted to find something that was right on the edge, I said, what about programmatic advertising, right? And I said, well, could programmatic advertising be considered agentic? And what Claude, which is my favorite tool, came back very quickly, was like, well, it does have some autonomous decision making, right? So it comes up with real time bidding, deciding where to place things, right? Those are actual decisions, and it can actually place ads. So it's taking tasks, and you could argue that sometimes some of them have like multi-step planning elements, but where AI felt that fell short of like what most people would say is a true agent. It doesn't have full agency. It has a limited scope of action. Doesn't have a lot of creative generation. It used the term bounded initiative, and it's reactive versus proactive. Whereas something that's more proactive is something that you would consider to be more on the agentic angle. But I actually think doing this session has, my one takeaway already is that we just have to understand that agentic AI is a spectrum. You have kind of like baby agentic AI, which is on the lower end, and LinkedIn is coming out with their hiring assistant. You have different solutions that will actually call all of the applicants that apply to a job and have a phone voice AI driven conversation where it will take all that and actually take the information, put it into your ATS, which is actually, I think, one of the strongest points of these solutions, because it does the work that no human likes doing, which is data entry. But that's on the I say lower end, right? It's on the lighter end of agentic AI. I still think we're early on, and we're not seeing full end to end agentic AI through the process. But I also think part of that is because in certain areas of the world, you have to be mindful of different regulations around automated decision making, and there's certain elements of the talent lifecycle where you shouldn't be using AI to automatically make decisions, or you're on the wrong side of regulations.
Glenn, when you started talking about the AI that you use, Perplexity, do you say Perplexity or Claude?
Claude in this case, just to ask about
Claude. Okay.
the programmatic advertising, because it's kind of on the
Yeah,
fence. Yeah.
it is. Um, when you described how you have the conversation with them, that to me, that really showed the impact that AI is having on our society that we often don't talk about. It's that confidence that it gives us. It's the validation that we're making a right decision. It's the speed of research. We can quickly find what we're looking for. I think a common phrase in my house at home, because I use ChatGPT for personal reasons all the time, is let me run that by ChatGPT. Oh, let me run this. My favorite thing is, hey, fix this email so HR doesn't come after me, right? It's like, it's become kind of our confidant. And I haven't seen a lot of AI for recruiters that have come out yet that has really targeted that. Um, and it's something that we're working on here in hireEZ that we're going to show you this week and we're going to release next week,
Nice.
where you kind of have that support system, that confidence that really is going to help recruiters get the job done a little better. But it's one of those things that I think is fascinating that has really changed our society, is that the dopamine that ChatGPT gives us, or any kind of advanced AI system, and how I just want to hear you elaborate on this and how it's come sort of part of our daily lives now. And I think we should expect that in our workflow as well. Like you just said, though, there are times and a place for it, right?
Well, yeah. Well, if I wanted to, I could have sat here and thought through the whole analysis of why programmatic advertising could and could not be considered agentic AI, and it also depends if there's generative AI involved. But yeah, I could make short work of that in 30 seconds. And it's not just asking a question, though, it's having the conversation, which is something I always talk about when I'm training anybody on this, is that you have to think of it more like a person, because you don't just stop at the one question, I got my output. You're scratching the surface of the power of these solutions when you do that. Um, the more I continue to think about it is like, you should think of it like a person that's kind of just like on hand, ready to help you at all times. And I have been telling people I don't like the term assistant. I also don't like co-pilot. And I think part of that is because those terms kind of relegate it to a minor supporting role as opposed to a potential peer role. You just heard that SAP did a really interesting survey with executives, right? These are the highest level CEOs, right? They are using it as a peer collaborator. Say, what am I missing? What else should we be thinking about when it comes to these business challenges? Um, in that case, it's not a co-pilot that's just sitting there waiting to be your backup, and they're not just an assistant. So it is a change in behavior, and I do think that you and other people that are kind of like leading this is one thing. I encounter many people that are still stuck at like, what do I ask?
Yeah.
Because
I
it's
think,
the change management part is huge, right? The tech is
yeah,
there. The tech is actually limited more by you than the technology itself. You may not even be asking the right questions, prompting properly to be able to get full value out of it.
there was a piece to that SAP study that I believe I commented, and it took me a full day to really understand when it was talking about work-life balance and how many executives are using ChatGPT or any kind of AI just to have better work-life balance, or is giving them work-life balance. And the first when I read that, and I read the press release, I went to SAP's website, I really tried to dig deep. Like, what do they mean by that? How is AI give them a better work-life balance? And then I thought that it's removing that stressors, those barriers, that helps them. Because like, when you're an executive, Glenn, I'm an executive. We're not CEOs of major companies, but we do have jobs that involve high pressure decisions, right? And if there was a system that can make those decisions easier, then no wonder why it's better work-life balance. And I think that's what's been missing in recruiting. Dan and I was quizzing Dan earlier, and I said, we're talking about software engineer. I was like, Dan, you could have recruited on software engineers your entire career, but you don't really know what you're doing. Same with you. And here's what I mean by that is we were never software engineers. So we operate with what we know, what we've learned, and what we've been given by hiring managers. And how many times have we gone to hiring managers and say, "Oh, do you have a resume of a candidate you liked in the past or who has done this job?"
Yep.
And then you have your intake meeting, you have the job description, you have the resume, and all three don't match. And you're like, "Great, now I got to go out and enter some keywords, right? And try to find these people, send them a message that we hope they read, that they open, they understand, and then wait for the responses to come back." And it's like, to me, it's like recruiting has been missing, that assurance, that support, that those statistics that say what can help us do our jobs better, more confidently, to improve the recruiter work-life balance. Because now, amongst all of the obstacles, it is, I hate to use the overused word doing less with more, but the workload continues to increase when the number of our counterparts, hasn't increased. And so it's like, I think this is something that it's so ready for our industry, and I think it's something that could help. And it's cool to see executives adopt, because that will set the tone for, I think, AI and recruiting budgets that we haven't really seen yet. But it's something that I'm looking forward to.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, and it's funny. I don't know why the back of my mind just brought it back to the surface. Daniel, someone asked about some other examples of agentic AI, and I don't think I referenced a whole bunch. There's other solutions out there, and it's not about naming them, but there is an automated outbound sourcing solution, that will just take a job and it will look for matches, and it will decide who to contact. It will decide what questions to ask. And a lot of the questions it asks are based on what it doesn't know, which is something that I'm a fan of, which is don't ask the obvious questions. If you can tell this person has a skill in an area, don't just confirm that. And that the one solution I have in mind, one of the examples that they shared, and I think I mentioned this in a LinkedIn post, was that it was able to autonomously recruit and essentially hire, obviously passed over to people at some point, a chief medical officer, right? And so you would think, that's a really high level type of role. This person was responsible for like 7,000 clinicians. This is like a million comp plus per year. And you're like, oh, it's executive search. You're like, that's what I like to point out. Like, if you think about what's the ultimate in the human element of recruiting, you could argue that executive search is an area in that thing. But there's actually multiple solutions now that are breaking into that domain and showing that, people don't mind chatting with AI. Another example I wanted to bring up that I haven't seen the solution yet. So if there's any, I know we have a solution provider on the call. It's something that I've been talking about for a while. I haven't seen it yet. And it would be Agentic, which is creating subject lines and outbound messaging that improves based on data. So I guess the inspiration for that is like, AlphaGo playing Go, and how did it get so good? It got good by playing itself lots of times. In this case, if you have a feedback loop to figure out like automatic A/B testing, which I know some solutions do, but what they're not doing is that, I would say, agentic element, which is automatically then adjusting and then saying, I'm actually going to lean into. It's exactly what good people do. Like, hey, I started using these types of subject lines, and I start to get a higher response rate. I'm going to lean into that a little bit more. And on one hand, I think I'm super excited about that. On the other, I'm a little worried because, like, how far can you go when it comes to like perfection in messaging? But if you're doing it based off of feedback, actual response rates, and the AI is able to learn patterns from that, you're essentially supercharging what like the best humans do. Because that's how we've gotten good at what we've done. This could do it on a scale like AlphaGo, right? It could just go crazy and go beyond what any person could do and get to the level of having the highest response rates. And that would be agentic because it would be like a self-learning loop as well. And it would take its own action on, now I'm going to experiment with this. I'm going to try my own other A/B test. And it's just going to continue to go because it's pursuing a goal on its own in that case, which would be,
And that's the beauty.
rates.
Yeah, that's the beauty of agentic and the dopamine hit I was talking about. I just commented in the chat, like we all have it in our nature. It's to our core to be better, to grow, to learn, right? It's how we're wired as humans. And the fact that AI can do that with us, it's I've when, exactly like the subject lines. I don't know what's I'm in marketing now, Glenn. I don't know what subject lines work. My email marketer experiments all the time, but not only is AI learning, the user is learning with it. And that's why I think this is so cool and impactful is that, it's like, to me, that's the definition of agentic, right? It's being able to learn with it, watch it grow, watch it learn. I'm sure there are times we've used it and blindly copied and pasted, stuff like that too, because we trust it. But ultimately, to me, it's the learning that is so inspirational.
I
I'm
agree.
very fired up about this.
Yeah, I could tell. I wanted to mention, I saw Angela, if that's okay, Daniel, I just saw.
Yeah.
She had a question about like the concern is the flood of messaging. It sounds like exactly the same. This is an interesting one, right? Because I have done trainings with recruiters and someone else has raised like, this is kind of scary because what happens if everybody becomes just awesome at writing messaging because they're using AI to write messaging that's consistently effective and creative and inexhaustible in terms of coming up with new ways to apply proven best practices, because there's just even limits to that humans. But what's interesting, and I've thought about this a lot because, like, this sounds weird, but I have a decent prompt, right, that creates good outreach messages. If I were to just publish that online, everybody could just copy and paste that, right? And on one hand, that's kind of cool because it raises the bar for the outbound messaging that would come from those people. And the fear of that is actually not bad because these are, and I get to sound smart here, so they're non-deterministic, right? So you can run the same prompt over and over and over and over, and you'll get a different message every single time because it's probabilistic. And in fact, that's how people are. So a person is not very good at messaging if you're always copying and pasting the same template, right? Maybe customizing it for sure. I've done that too. But Generative AI is truly probabilistic. You can give it essentially all of the guidance around the best elements of psychology, neuromarketing, so many interesting things you can feed it, and it will use those things very effectively. And it's not like everything that it spits out is going to be absolute genius, but I continue to smile when I look at the output. I'm like, this is good. This is good. I would use this. Maybe
So
minimal.
when you put
It's
Glenn, when you put a
exciting. So
prompt
it's like
in,
the pressure's off of me, because now I can use it, but I'm infusing my expertise and I'm explaining, here's how I write messages, use these things, and it will create that. So even if we all use the same prompt, we'll all get different output. Now, granted, you might argue that the level of it raises. That is a little scary because what if the new normal is everything is great? Then how do you differentiate when everything is good? I haven't figured that part out because I think there's a ceiling to how far you can go in terms of messaging excellence. Um, we certainly haven't hit that yet, but it is an interesting thing to think about.
how many different platforms do you put that specific prompt in before you say, yes, I'm going to take that message and this is the one I'm going to utilize? And then do you merge the responses and then put it in and said, hey, here are these three different responses. What
Yeah.
is the best one? Walk me through, a use case utilizing that.
Yeah. I have done that for exercises in messaging, and I'm not trying to over index on that, but it's a really nice finite use case.
Sure.
Um, I like Claude, ChatGPT, Gemini, Perplexity. Um, I will not always use all four, but it takes a second to copy and paste the same prompt, and it's like dealing with four different people. There's some general overlap in terms of approach, which I'm not that surprised by, but I'm also not disappointed by it. But there's always something that I can take away from one of their outputs. But again, think of it like four people next to you. And you're like,
Sure.
hey, what do you guys think? And they're like, here are my thoughts. And you're like, great, I'm going to synthesize the best of all of that. I've always felt like the best practice is absorbing and using everybody else's best practice. So why wouldn't you then use these tools to do that? And the same thing when it comes to strategy, right? So it's not just messaging. It can also be sourcing strategy, but it could also be your onboarding plan. It could also be social recruiting strategy. So it doesn't have to be small finite things. It could be much higher order when it comes to. Oh, and I saw a question in there about matching, and I have to share. I can't mention the name of the company because I'm not allowed to. But there was a person I know in the financial services sector that had one person build a large language model based matching solution, and it wasn't even the most advanced LLM on the market. And they were able to benchmark that against three other commercial solutions that everyone in this call would be aware of, and it outperformed them. And it didn't just outperform them in terms of talent in the database. They actually did some interesting analyses comparing it to past hires. Now, past hires that are now top performers, past hires that are no longer like regrettable and non-regrettable attrition. So they've done some really interesting analyses. And in every case, it's definitely well above random. So there's a pattern in the large language model's ability to identify people who are good for particular roles. And I know something I think we even chatted about at a conference last year is that some people are like, yeah, well, people can see potential. If you haven't tried this, generative AI can also see the potential in people. It's not just about keyword matching. Generative AI doesn't even work that way. So if you just prompt it properly and you're not saying, I want to find a exact conceptual match, you can say, I also want you to be on the lookout for people that may not be exactly there or have I'd say adjacent skills or non-obvious career paths. You tell it what you want it to do. It's actually going to do a pretty good job of staying on target to do that. So when it comes to matching, I feel like it's actually a fantastic resource. It's actually what we always wanted when it comes to true semantic search. Generative large language models understand, and again, that's air quotes, but it seems to understand language at literally the sentence level, whereas historically all other matching solutions are either using term or terms, which is all nouns, or it's using some form of like deep learning where it vectorizes it and it finds it, in terms of proximity in a vector space, which is not the same. That's not true semantic matching. It's kind of like a conceptual match, but large language models are very good at true semantic matching.
Doug had a question in the chat. From a practical perspective, do you have a strategy for utilizing a agentic AI in a small company, versus enterprise companies? Like, what use cases are you seeing from a small company to a large enterprise company? Are they different? Are they the same? What are some practical use cases people are utilizing right now?
Uh, I I think I haven't noticed that much of a difference between small versus large. I do think that starting small is generally a best practice, and you have to start with some kind of a clear problem or challenge. And it always doesn't have to be a problem. Sometimes I key in on that. People are like, "What problem are trying to solve?" Sometimes it can be flipped over and be like, "What can we do better?" You could call it a problem. I think it's negative thinking, but um, you have to be very clear about what are we trying to do and why. I do think there's some FOMO. The hype that we talked about earlier causes a lot of pressure, I think, on people and organizations and companies to feel like we have to do something. I feel like it's important, no matter what the size of the company, you just take a pause and be like, let's look at our current process. Where are opportunities to do something better? And it's not just where can we save money? And again, legitimate business concern. I'm not going to fault people for thinking that way, but that's just one dimension of many that people should be thinking about. Um, just identify a problem. And a really good place to start, right, could be in the talent domain. We know that lots of companies are dealing with more applicants than ever before, right? So we also know that people are not going to be able to reach out to and provide an experience to all of those people, but with AI you can. And that's why I see that as a really nice way to start if you haven't started using generative AI or even considering agentic AI, is handling the processes at the top of the funnel and improving those experiences and giving everybody an opportunity to be considered, because that's not happening in all companies today.
Awesome.
So starting small and being mindful, and then being careful to measure, because you want to make sure we're not just doing this because it sounds cool, but because we can measure that it has an impact, and not just on cost or productivity, but also on things like experience, right? And also a data strategy is something you have to think about. It's like, well, what are we trying to do? We're trying to deliver better experiences. Well, what are you doing to gather the data that allows you to develop hyper-personalized experiences? But it does start with the problem, and you should start small, do it in a controlled fashion, get measurements, prove that it's doing something or not. Because sometimes you might say, hey, we had an hypothesis and it really didn't bear out. Other cases, you're like, hey, this is promising. And then you have a business case within your organization, your company, to say, let's go ahead and scale this, and then maybe start looking at the second problem.
Last question as we wrap up. Looking ahead, how do you see agentic AI evolving in the next 5 to 10 years? If I have the same conversation with Glen Cathey in a decade, where are we in? Are we in some sort of a universe talking robot to robot, and we're on the couch, hanging out, and they're having the conversation? Where are we going in the future?
Oh, I hate predicting the future. So in a sense, I love the question. I do think that companies are certainly going to see how far they can go in these areas. And there, as I mentioned all along, there's going to be some incentives for companies to say, well, maybe we can do more with less. Again, understand the business pressure in some cases, hope that not all companies take just that route. The reality is, you could actually, I will make a prediction. I predict that there will be at least some companies that have largely automated the recruitment process, and I can even argue like internal mobility process, where the human in the loop is for talent acquisition, the hiring manager, and for internal could also be the hiring manager, but it could also be initiated by the employee. That there is a human in the loop, so that any decisions that are high risk or material in terms of impact are still there's still humans involved in that, but everything else is orchestrated by a person. And I know that sounds a little bit scary. I'm not saying that there isn't a use for recruiters in the future. I'm not saying that at all. but I know that's how far you could go. And for maybe small, medium-sized businesses, you will probably have essentially agentic recruiters that are under the direction and orchestration of hiring managers, and they're able to get what they need to get done with this technology until they scale to a point where they might want and need people in the process beyond the hiring manager. That's a volume thing, but I would be shocked if we're not there in the future.
For sure. Any last minute words of advice as we wrap up?
You asked me a little bit earlier in the conversation. I think it is very important to stay on top of these things. I'll also tell you that it's incredibly difficult to do that. A combination of newsletters that are out there can be helpful, and they don't even have to be specific to our domain. You just want to be like the Neuron is one. There's many. You could literally just search for it. You can ask AI to give you suggestions. Podcasts in the space. It's always good to just kind of listen to those from time to time. Use good old Google Alerts. They always help me on a daily basis stay on top of things that are evolving in the space of generative AI and agentic AI. So a combination of those things in just a few minutes a day when you're very busy in your day job will allow you to at least stay more involved in what's really going out there. And then I would also argue that if you're hopefully in a position in your company where you can be a champion for this, this is things you need to be experiencing with manually. Imagine how it might be able to be brought into your organization, intelligently and safely and responsibly in a more automated fashion. Again, not just for cost savings, but for like the benefit to your business, the benefit to the hiring manager, the benefit to you, the benefit to the talent involved in the process. If you think about it from that perspective, that's a win all around. So that's my encouragement, is that you have to stay close, be a part of the future. Otherwise, you might find yourself on the wrong side of it in the years to come. And I wouldn't want to be in that place. You want to be using these solutions and architecting the future, what the future looks like, as opposed to kind of being a victim of, well, this happened to me. But you have your hand on the steering wheel with regard to where you're going in the future.
Love it. Well, I just want to say thank you so much, Glenn, for taking the time and exposing us to everything about AI. I know I learned a lot. If you haven't done so, please go to LinkedIn, follow Glenn. He has a ton of amazing topics and content that he pushes out every single day. And I get smarter and smarter and smarter the more I read from him. Take his advice, dive in and take the wheel. If you want more information, feel free to contact hireEZ.com. We have a huge announcement coming on March 31st. Please sign up for that webinar. You will be really happy that you did. So again, thank you so much, Glenn. I really appreciate your time, and have a fabulous rest of the day.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. Have a good one.